Thank you, Connie, and good afternoon, everyone. So this next session is about consumption. So we've mostly been looking at carbon emissions so far through the lens of emissions that are directly produced within the geographic boundary of C40 cities. So pollution that comes out the tailpipe of a vehicle or from an industrial plant, methane rotting from waste, electricity drawn down to power buildings or offices. So in the technical speak of carbon accounting, these are territorial emissions, and I realise I should now be pressing a clicker to make the slide work, and I've left the clicker there. There it is. They gave me this earlier and said, don't touch it, which is why I forgot it, because I could have affected the whole thing. Here we go. So, okay, I might have to press it once more. Right, so there's our territorial emissions. So that's the kind of methodology that's used by the United Nations to measure the emissions of every country in the world. It's the methodology that C40 uses for our Deadline 2020 programme, and it's a very useful methodology, but it does have some limitations when it comes to cities, particularly big cities like C40 cities, because just a large proportion of the stuff that is consumed within C40 cities is not produced within that geographic boundary and therefore isn't counted at all against the emission accounts. Which is why we've been working with a number of cities in C40 now to take a slightly different lens and look at the total emissions of a city based on consumption. So just to give an example of that, if we were looking at emissions from the transport sector, using the territorial emissions approach, we'd only be looking at the burning of fuel in those cars, gas and petrol, when they're driving around in the city. But actually, that's only half of the emissions from cars. The other half is to do with the production of the vehicle, the materials that are mined and use, the metals, the plastics, etc., that are used to make that car. And mostly now in C40 cities, that production process takes place outside of the city. So when we start to use a consumption lens, instead what we do is we look at the tailpipe emissions, but we also trace back the emissions that have been made to produce that car right the way back up the supply chain, right back through to the factory and indeed to the extraction process of those materials as well. And this is what it looks like when you add in that consumption lens. And you can immediately see now, looking at the yellow circle here, that the circle gets a lot bigger. The quantum of emissions that C40 cities are responsible for is in fact 60% bigger when we use the consumption versus the territorial emissions. Another thing that it really shows us is that the emissions from the wealthier cities get even bigger still, because wealthier citizens consume a lot more stuff around the world. And indeed, that's true in an individual city as well. The amount of emissions from an individual wealthier citizen are higher. It also changes the categories that are important. So when we're using the territorial methodology, the two biggest areas where we see emissions are in energy consumed in used in buildings. These slides have got a mind of their own if they keep changing here. And in transport, when we use the consumption methodology, buildings are still important, but it's less about the energy that's consumed in the buildings and more about the materials that are used to construct those buildings. And the big change is that the food sector becomes bigger than any other when we use the lens of consumption. And that's primarily due to meat consumption and the farming of animals for meat. And indeed, that's the reason why we've only been serving vegetarian food at this summit in the hall. So I'm glad to see is a popular decision. So you could ask, when we're starting to use this consumption methodology, isn't this just making the problem harder? Isn't C40 making all of your lives more difficult? It was hard enough working out how we were going to halve emissions using the traditional methodology. Now the pie is a lot bigger, the problem's a lot harder. Actually, what I found in talking to mayors is they really welcome this approach, because we're moving into the area of things that people, our citizens, talk about in their everyday lives. What they eat, how they travel, the clothes that they wear, as you can see, is also an issue on the screen. But most importantly, it just gives, taking the two together, a more accurate, complete picture. So what we find with that consumption emissions total, 10% of all the emissions in the world are generated in C40 cities. That's the equivalent of India and Japan's emissions combined. So these 94 cities have an extremely big footprint. So what we're going to do in the session now is to dig into the two biggest areas of consumption emissions, food and construction. And we're going to kick off with food. And I'm really delighted here now to be handed over to a woman whose organisation, the EAT Foundation, I think has just produced a really world-changing piece of analysis with the Lancet, showing us what a planetary health diet looks like. That's a diet that will both give individuals the best chance of a healthy life and to reduce emissions from agriculture to safe levels. She is someone who is a constant source of inspiration to me and has become a very good friend over the last few years. So please give a huge welcome to the stage to the founder and executive director of the EAT Foundation, Dr. Gunhild Stordalen.